Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. First for Safe Sport Month and for our first presentation in Safe Sport Month. It's a Safe Sport update, provincial and national landscape. I'm honored to be the host of this. My name, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Elana Liberman. I am the Safe Sport lead with Sport Nova Scotia. And again, it is my honor to be here moderating this. I'll be presenting a little bit. Before we get started, I'd like to just go over a few housekeeping rules, if that's okay. Just to be reminded that this session is being recorded and will be online later. And to mute your mic, if you don't mind. We'll also do that, but just to keep that in mind. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. We'll try to get to them today. If not, I've put my email address for those of you who don't have it. If you don't have mics, we can also put that as well. If there are questions specific to one of our presenters, Lorraine, we might try and focus on those because we have her here. And again, it is an honor to have both Mike and Lorraine here. The purpose of today's Safe Sport update is to give an overview as to what's going on provincially and nationally at a safe sport level, and to discuss some of the specific issues that were raised in advance of this presentation, including topics such as the rule of two. The outline of the presentation will be as follows. First, we'll provide an overview of the provincial and national landscape. We'll answer some previously submitted questions. There was an email that was sent out to our PSOs to submit some questions, and we have a few of those. We'll do our best to answer any questions that are raised during the presentation via the chat box. And then we'll have some closing remarks and just the announcements of the next set of presentations as we move forward. So without further ado, please let me introduce our two other panelists. As I said, my name is Elana Liberman. I'm the Safe Sport lead with Sport Nova Scotia. We've got Mike Hudson here, as many of you know. He is a sport consultant with the province of Nova Scotia. And we've got Lorraine Lafreniere, who is the CEO of the Coaching Association of Canada. You guys, I can't see your video, but if you can wave and tell people you're here, that would be great. There we go. There's Mike, smiling face, and hopefully we'll see Lorraine in a second as well.
Hi there. I'm just starting my video.
Perfect.
Oh, no, it's, I think maybe Kate has removed permissions for me to start my video.
Well, we definitely want to see you, so we will work on that. But in the meantime, I can get started and we'll make sure that we can see you. Again, thank you. It is an honor to have you here, Lorraine and Mike. I know you've been instrumental in helping me get started in my role as Safe Sport lead. That actually leads us into sort of the next part of the discussion, just to tell you a little bit about what has happened in Nova Scotia since I came on in January. I did a lot of background discussions with Lorraine, with Mike, and people who are helping me instrumentally in getting started in the safe sport work in the province. Some of the key features that I've done, we did a PSO survey, as many of you know, asking what is happening in safe sport within your sport, and what do we need to do? Where are the what barriers do you face? So we did that survey, and that informed a lot of the recommendations that we'll talk about. As some of you may know, the CAC came out with a training module that most of us have taken. Mike and I went around to different groups and did focus groups and got feedback on that. So we've done things like that. There were a number of us in the Safe Sport Working Group. It used to be the task force, and now we're a small working group. And we took True Sport training, and that True Sport training will probably inform a lot of the language and the discussions. And in fact, we have our True Sport presentation next week. Mike and I have gone around to different university groups and done presentations on safe sport. So we're continuing those discussions. We launched Safe Sport Month, which is why we're here. And within Safe Sport Month, there's some really exciting things, including, which I hope you've seen, is our Safe Sport video awareness campaign. my understanding, and I looked last night, is that it has reached almost 6,000 people on Facebook alone, and I believe there were 80 shares, which is phenomenal. The awareness, that was the main goal, is to create awareness and discussions and talking about safe sport. So I couldn't be more pleased. I couldn't be more pleased about the video and about the sharing. And I, again, because it's here and it's hopefully will get out to the participants. Thank you so much for being part of that. We literally could not have done that without you. Part of the Safe Sport Working Group and part of the work that I've done is to create a one-pager, a sort of FAQ resources, Safe Sport one-pager. We envision that one-pager to actually be a hard copy that will be given out at the time of registration, and we're hoping and we're continuing to work on that. We have also created a Safe Sport Nova Scotia, safesportns.ca website, where we're going to continue to put videos such as this one, our Safe Sport campaign video, resources, and any information that relates to Safe Sport will be on that. We made some recommendations to government, and this is where the substance of my part of the presentation comes in, and Mike will also continue that. So the initial recommendations that we made were establishing a minimum safe sport standards across the province, and we look at some different areas. We looked at background screening. So what does that mean? And we'll talk about that in a minute. We looked at education and training. What would be the minimum standards? And we were lucky enough, as I said, to have that new CAC training that came out on April 1st. And we looked at policies and procedures, and that's what Mike's going to talk about. And we'll go into these in a little bit more detail. We were really interested in and have actually started work on creating a truly independent complaints process for sports-related maltreatment issues. So that is something that's being worked on, and we can talk a little bit about that as well. We wanted to ensure that safe sport principles were well represented in the sport development tool, the questions, as I know that's relevant and important to a lot of you. And as I said, a lot of the major work that's been happening over maybe the last month or two has been the Safe Sport Awareness Campaign and video website and this one-pager or FAQ. So we can move on. Again, some of the, just a little bit more detail about some of the initial work that we did related to background screening. So again, I did a lot of research when I came in. I sort of surveyed what was going on across the province, what was going on nationally. I looked at international, and I recognized that background screening was inconsistent and misunderstood by the sector. We didn't have really, not all PSOs had a true mechanism for tracking screening and coaches and volunteers. And the result was that there was a lot of under-screening or over-screening. So we're gonna, can't do it, we don't have the capacity, or we're just not gonna do it, or we're just going to screen for everything and ask for every type of screening. And so the recommendations that we came up with, that we made to government, were to adopt the CAC screening matrix. And if you haven't seen that, I would highly recommend that you look for it, and I can certainly send it to you. And those provide the provincial minimum standards. They'll be part of the policy, and Mike will talk a little bit about that as screening policy. We've also looked into ways of assisting the PSOs with tracking mechanisms. So how do you track it? So if you do a background check and it's due in 2 years, how do you make sure you've tracked it in the first place? And what's the bring forward system? So how can we make sure that those people that were screened recognize that they have to, get another test, another screen in a few years' time? We've talked about a decision-making tree. So if a positive check comes back, what are the questions that need to be asked? And we've looked at, and this is something that we'll continue to look at, is in terms of the free or reduced or perhaps subsidized rate for checking all volunteers in Nova Scotia, and that's some work that will be ongoing. So that was sort of the initial recommendation with respect to background screening that we made to government. The next area that we looked at and we talked about is education. And one of the things, again, that I did when I started in January was to look at all the different types of safe sport education out there. And there's comprehensive and clear safe sport education. A lot of the programs, what I noticed was that they focus on different areas. And so I wanted to talk about and sort of learn, can we combine that? And actually we'll talk about how CAC did a really good job of doing that. There's different motivations for requiring safe sport, whether it's NCCP compliance, whether it's funding, it's NSO requirements, whether it's liability. So there were a lot of different motivations and what was driving people or not driving people to take the safe sport or a safe sport education. The other thing that I noticed was that education is traditionally geared towards coaches, which again is important, but we wanted to talk about maybe there's other education or maybe other opportunities to make this awareness, to bring education to the public so that we can start having that safe sport dialogue. So again, the recommendations that we made to government included having consistent safe sport education based on rule, almost like an education matrix. And so that's something that we're looking at. The CAC's 90-minute education, safe sport education, if you haven't done it, I highly recommend, and we can certainly send you the link and get you through that. It's very easy to access, it's free. We talked about that, having that as a minimum requirement for sport leaders in Nova Scotia, including coaches, officials, board members, and volunteers, and we're moving forward with that. There's a lot of supplementary safe sport education, including Commit to Kids, Respect in Sport, MED, and there are a lot of resources. And again, on our new Safe Sport website, we've included all of those. And again, if anybody has any questions, we can certainly gear you towards the education. And as I mentioned, with the CAC, perhaps being the base, talking about an education matrix. So depending on your role or in your involvement, what level of education that you'll have moving forward or that's required. And those, again, are the recommendations. Thanks, Mike. And Mike, by the way, is helping move the screen along. So he's doing a wonderful job. Thank you, Mike. Because for those of you who do know me, you know I wouldn't be able to do this and also move the screen. That's my goal for the rest of the year, is to become more proficient. One of the things that we talked about, we noticed, we've discussed at length, is that there is no true independent third party mechanism for dealing with complaints in the sports system. We recognize that as an issue, and we are working, as I said, to try and come up with a timely, cost-effective, independent case resolution mechanism. We recognize that cases involving or complaints involving maltreatment can be complex. We're looking at the role of Safe Sport Lead to triage those complaints. And we're looking at existing processes. So this isn't going to be sort of done. We're gathering a lot of information. It will be a lot of work, committed to it and looking at it and seeing the best way to create this third-party mechanism. So as I mentioned, so those are sort of the major things, as well as the policies and procedures that we've been looking at. Mike's going to take over from here to talk about that. But in terms of, again, the initial recommendations to government from a safe sport overview landscape, this is what's out there, this is where sort of the direction. Again, we looked at background screening, education and training, creating an independent complaints process, and creating a policy suite. And this is where I'm going to mute myself and let Mike take over. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Elana, and thank you very much, Lorraine, for joining us today. From a policies and procedures, what Elana, what we saw was that there's inconsistency among the PSOs in regard to their abuse and harassment policies. It's a requirement of funding, but Elana and I looked at a lot of the policies that you submitted, and it was a bit of a mixed bag of NSO policies. Sometimes it was an abuse policy, sometimes it was a harassment policy. So the wording of these policies were often vague and confusing, and really we felt that they maybe were not that implementable if we did have an issue. And also the question around capacity of a PSO to actually implement those policies if they were needed. So what we decided that would be a good idea, and this was based on some of the research that Elana did around other provinces, and Saskatchewan has a very similar setup, is that we were to adopt a province-wide safe sport policy suite, and it's based on the University Code, the new Universal Code, and I think Lorraine's going to talk a little bit about that. And the idea is that it will be that this policy suite will be part of compliance for government eligibility for funding. So the idea is that these policies will be consistent across the PSOs, and also that eventually these policies will filter down at the community level, so that there'll be an alignment between safe sport policies at a PSO level and a community level. We recognize that a lot of PSOs also have NSO safe spot policies, and we want to also make sure that we don't want to duplicate where this already been done, but we need to ensure there's alignment between what the NSO is requiring their PSOs to do and what we need from a provincial level. And the idea is that we would have third-party experts to help Elana and myself in this process. It wasn't just done internally. So in terms of the Safe Spot Policy Suite, so we've actually working with a Sport and Law group. A lot of you know Steve Indig through, some of you have done work with Steve at a PSO level, helping you write policy. So there'll be an overall blanket safe spot policy, and within that there'll be code of conduct and ethics, discipline and complaints policy. There'll be an alternate dispute resolution policy, an appeal policy, social media policy and guidelines, team athlete travel policy, which is really important with traveling with athletes and how we guide that work, and then a screening policy. So I'm not going to get too much into the detail, but the idea is that these will be required. And what I wanted to give you today was really a kind of a timeline for implementation. Now, this is not a timeline that's set in stone. This is Elana and I sat down, just sort of working out when this will be, when we will introduce to the PSOs, when you will be working on them, and at what time will they become a requirement from a funding perspective. So, as I said earlier, Sport and Law Group have been contracted to assist Nova Scotia to develop the policies and processes around safe sport. Elana has also created a PSO policy focus group, so that it's not just top down, it'll be bottom up as well, and it'll allow the PSOs to have input into the development of the policy suite and the guidelines around it. What we feel, and Steve, guided by Steve, is that the development of the complaints process in conjunction with Sport and Law Group will be the first piece of this, because the policies that we create will be dependent on what the complaints process looks like. So that's what Elana is working on right now with Steve. She's creating a framework, a flow chart on how complaints will be dealt with in Nova Scotia in the sports system. In January 2021, we'll be introducing the policy suite to the PSOs, and then over the winter, spring, there'll be education opportunities, so that we can have some policy development within the PSOs. So that is ongoing consultation will happen with Elana, the Safe Spot lead on policy development during the spring and summer, with the idea that PSOs will have their safe spot policies aligned with NSO policies around the fall of 2021. And it'll be March 22, then we hope that it will be the completion date for this work, and it'll become part of provincial government eligibility for core funding. And because Sport Nova Scotia and the provincial government's eligibility is aligned, it'll become a requirement for Sport Nova Scotia funding too. So that's the general timeline for the implementation of this work. And I know Elana and I are really excited about working with Steve and getting this work and making this happen, because it's such an integral part of our safe sport compliance. Okay, so unless there's any questions, I'm going to now hand it over to Lorraine Lafreniere, who's the CEO of the Coaching Association of Canada. She's been a pioneer in safe sport work across the country, and she's going to give us kind of a national perspective and sort of tying it back to some of the work that we're doing at the provincial level. So thank you, Lorraine, for joining us today, and I look forward to listening to you.
Thanks very much. And then so I'm assuming I don't have control of the PowerPoint, so someone is flipping the slides for me, so I'll be aware of that as I speak. I just want to start, thanks, Mike. first of all, this is like a daunting task, and I really appreciate that. And, you know, safe sport isn't an end game, it's a journey. And so I think as we work through all of these policies and we work through safe sport, I think we just have to think about that in terms of the conversation will continue, and you'll learn through the experience as I am and as we are collectively in how to maintain safe sport. The key here is, and I know from the PSO perspective, sometimes there's a tension between what's happening in the province and what you're hearing from your national federation. And so I think one of the most important things in that space is how the communication is happening with your consultant within Sport Nova Scotia, as well as with your national federation. And we're trying to support making sure that, you know, we respect the government, the provincial government jurisdiction, and implementing what's super important for their objectives. And, you know, that policy suite is incredible, and it's a really important thing. And I'd argue you're way ahead of the game in terms of the way you're implementing that. And kudos to you for having a PSO working group. I think that's really critical, and to hear that voice, because after all, the implementation is left with those individuals who actually deliver in the sport. And I think that's a really important commitment to making sure we get that right as we build all of these pieces. So if we turn to the next slide, the first thing I want to be able to share with you is how we are all interdependent. And so this slide has, many of you have seen this before, whether at the Safe Sports Summits or some of the conversations we've had. And it's really an important reminder for all of us to know that we are interdependent in this. The government, you as individuals, your organizations, your coaches, your athletes, your event organizers. It is the way the legal system works, which means we share in protecting individuals within our care. And so the care is, what is the acceptable minimum standard to protect individuals? And the Sport Nova Scotia is taking huge steps to set up the minimum standards of care that are required to do that. And that is a very important protection for the sustainability of sport in Canada. And so it's really important to think about that as we go through where we are. And the other thing I'll just mention here is, in the legal system, there's kind of two thresholds that come up. One is the legal requirement. So we'll talk a little bit later about age of consent. The other is actually what the best practice is out there. So in other words, the courts really do look at what best practice is, and they measure against your responsibilities of what that means. So I'm sure this is a big topic, and it's something we could dedicate another session to at another point in time if you're interested in engaging in that. But it's a really important shared liability, and I think that's the first message I wanted to be able to give. If we go to the next slide, I thought it might be worthwhile for me to be able to share with you some of the view of what's happening at the national level. So this is good because it's progress at the national level, and sometimes it's complicated because you're hearing certain things from your NSO versus what you're hearing from your government. And so these recommendations were what came out of the National Summit in May of 2019, which feels like a decade ago at this stage for all of us. But it really is about where the national sports system got in terms of consensus statement about needing a universal code, which leads to universal training, create the independence that Elana spoke about, being clear about what prohibited conduct looks like, making sure that we can have an implementation plan that's sustainable. And that's what Mike is talking about, is how do we get that done in a way that works for you and works for the system and works for the government. And then also to work with the provinces and territories in there to make sure we have a harmonized system. And you know, many of you might have been in the room when we had the Safe Sports Summit, which actually fed into these recommendations in the spring of 2019. And so your voice is communicated through these statements here, as well as every other province and territory in Canada. So what does it all mean? If we go to the next slide, it means that at the national level, just as Mike is talking about what's going to happen in what is happening at the provincial level, it means that we need to have our policies and our programs for a workplace free of harassment and abuse. And that's for employees and coaches and athletes and participants and volunteers. There is a requirement at the national level to have an independent third party who hears complaints of harassment and abuse cases, or who receives them. Now that's a complicated one, because depending on the governance model with your NSO, there's a bit of confusion around some of that. So that'll be an important conversation for you. As Mike talked about, we had the mandatory training on abuse and harassment that was launched and free of charge on April 1, 2020. And Mike talked about other great training programs. So the Commit to Kids program, which is really about an education on grooming and helping individuals to understand what that looks like, as well as Respect Group, which is another great training available out there. And then also the Universal Code. So let me give you a bit of a status update on the Universal Code. That is what should be in place for April 1, 2021. And I think that is where there will be a lot of work with the jurisdictions. So Nova Scotia or the Atlantic provinces, in looking at what needs to happen to make sure the codes don't interfere with each other, quite frankly, so that parents or participants, athletes and coaches, understand that regardless of what sport they choose to participate in or volunteer in or work in, or at what level, that they understand there's a code of conduct that supports everybody's understanding of what safe sport is. That's a long-term process, but I think it's a doable thing in the interest of safe sport for Canadians and all individuals within Canada. If I go to the next slide, I just want to come back to this real quickly, Elana, if that's okay. We still have a few minutes to talk about this, but really, I do need to talk about this. So kudos for the matrix on background screening, and kudos for the matrix on what to do when something comes up. That is an important guide, because we as individuals can't all have the same expertise in how to handle things with when background screening comes back in different ways and shapes or concerns or flags. The education and training, I really think an important piece there is, it is about helping a coach or a participant have a toolbox of understanding or common understanding. But education and respect training is really about empowering the bystander. We know that there are individuals who try to take access or use the system. And so really what we're trying to do here is to actually empower the bystander by having a clear understanding of duty of care, of what to do when, how to identify and work forward. And that's a critical piece in what education is truly about, ethics is truly about. Rule of two, all of you understand and have varying levels of engagement with the school systems. We know our teachers must implement the rule of two. And we're going to get into that subtlety, because I know there's a lot of questions around the rule of two versus what's feasible. But really the research is very clear, and we have a partnership with the Canadian Centre for Child Protection. Rule of two is actually the #1 deterrent to abuse in sport, because when you have two adults present or you have multiple people around, you are able to prevent abuse from happening. And so that is the #1 deterrent. And so that's why it's so important to understand and set a clear pathway for your sport and what needs to happen. I'm going to get into the rule of two, Elana, or should we stop here and then take some of the questions and maybe go through the infographics? What would you like to do?
Right now, I don't see any questions. If anybody does, you can put it in the chat box or put your hand up, but I don't see any. I think, again, some of the rule of two was submitted in advance. So unless something comes up, I'll monitor the chat box, but unless something comes up, I think we dive right in.
Okay. So
thanks, Lorraine. And
thanks,
thank you,
Elana. So please bring your questions. I really appreciate it. And so we'll go from there. So if we go to the next slide, and then we look at the age of protection. So I just want to remind individuals of this, and there are some provincial subtleties. So I do want to make sure that people understand that individuals who are in a position of authority must adhere to, again, that legislation. So there's no negotiation in this one, and it's not like the conversation around vicarious liability where there's the law and then there's best practice. This is not a best practice, this is the law. And so as a coach, if you're a teacher, if you're a coach, if you're you're in a position of trust and authority, regardless if you're 17 years old or 20 years old or 40 years old, you are a position trust. And so if we go to the next slide, what that means is this is the age of consent that is really clearly entrenched in the law about a position of trust. So I'm just going to go to the fourth line down, which is 16 plus, yes, but some exceptions. So let me define that one to you. If you have a 17-year-old coach and you have a 16-year-old athlete, there is no consent because there is a power relationship that exists, and it's really important when you bring in your young volunteers that they have a positive coaching experience, that they understand this legislation. It's black and white, and so it's really clear and it's really important. So if we continue now to the next slide, and I'll go through this, and I think maybe I'll share some best practices if there's not some questions, Elana, and maybe we'll go from there. So if we go to the next slide and pass one more, good, perfect. So one of the things, oh no, back one, thank you. So one of the things we see across the country is for sure the concern of capacity and rule of two and how to implement it, and is rule of two on a chairlift or in a putting green, or how is that? And it really, and part of it I think comes from the word rule. What we're trying to do is say, eliminate those extended periods of time or isolation which can exist within your sport. So if you're on a chairlift with an athlete and it's during a time when everybody else is on chairs with athletes, that's not a high risk environment. If you are coaching and you are in a training camp and you're out and away and you've got 5 teenagers and a 20-year-old coach who is doing a week-long training camp, that's when the rule of two becomes really critical. So no one-on-one meetings in a hotel room or in a private space. Yes, you can do a meeting in a cafeteria with others. There are many ways to look at it. And I think the key is to actually take a look at the activities that happen within a sport or within a club, and to identify those risk areas, and then to explicitly name them and publish them so that participants and parents and coaches understand how to manage those environments. And really, it's kind of a pre-season meeting, which is, what should I expect this season, and what do I do if that is not adhered to? And then the next piece, if we go to the next slide, is really the issue around virtual. So we're now in this virtual world, and how do we manage our environments? Of course, there's a minor need for it to be more explicit when we come to minors and individuals who fall under the 18-year-old range, or persons who have a vulnerable aspect to their training. You could just look at Special Olympics and how they're so strict and how they manage the delivery of their sport for really good reasons. But if you look at these virtual best practices, it's really, okay, how do you adopt? Because we aren't necessarily stopping all aspects of sport. And so it's no meeting rooms, no meetings one-on-one without, let's say, a parent consent. And even then, depending on age range, it should be a group setting meeting. No meetings from a bedroom. You know, it feels maybe obvious, but it's actually an important step to guide your coaches and athletes to be as explicit as you can related to safety in this new world that we live in. So Elana and Mike, I'm going to stop there, I think, and we can maybe tackle some of those questions if you like, or we can hear some of the questions from some of the delegates.
Mike, did you have anything before we move on to add about the rule of two, or anything you've received? Or Lorraine, you did a phenomenal job as always listening to you speak. Thank you. And Mike, did you want to add anything right
No,
at
I'm
this
good.
time?
I think we, I think Lorraine has answered that first question, and maybe to answer the second question there, Lorraine, around the CAC and the locker being used as a repository for safe sport, and would you like to answer that question?
Sure. And just before, Lorraine, before you go, these were some of the previously submitted questions that we had received. We had put out an email asking for people to submit questions, and just so that you know, these were some of the questions which were then forwarded by myself to Mike and Lorraine. So Lorraine,
Yeah.
I'll let you take it. Thank you.
Thanks. That's not an easy question to answer. So the locker, which is the education transcript of the coach, there's two kind of ways to look at how this might happen. One is we have the opportunity with our chartered professional coach or registered coach to get coaches to actually do a criminal record check. And it's limited right now to that criminal record check, the mandatory training as you've described, as well as the 2 letters of reference to be in the locker. So that actually is an opportunity to create that. But it requires coach consent. And it's also not something that's available necessarily without coach consent across sports. And we know a lot of our volunteers will coach in many sports. So can we create a database or locker that is just coach safety? Well, right now the answer is no, because privacy is a provincial jurisdiction. So as much as we've tried, we have failed in trying to set up a locker that would have a public database, and that's reams of legal advice there. The other opportunity here is, you know, if a sport wants to bring on a coach, well, sometimes you are able to, or sometimes you actually do have the consent of the coach when you get their locker number and their last name to be able to look up their transcript. And that can be not just education, but a screening tool. But it's not an easy access right now, but it is an option that we are trying to resolve with our partnership, whether that is something that can be done. So there are some provincial legislations that might be a bit different in Nova Scotia, but if you think about a coach who comes in or a volunteer who comes in, and your requirement is that they must do screening to be part of your volunteerism, and they refuse, well, the opportunity is that they're not a volunteer within your club or your sport. Now, I can tell you in the province of Ontario, we actually have legislation that says when and how you can ask for screening. It's actually a requirement within the province of Ontario. But if you have a person who's working with young children and who has opportunity and a privileged environment with young children in the province of Ontario, we're able to do that. So Elana and Mike, I would suggest that's another area that we can explore to help your partners. And then the question is, what is a safe sport standard? So that has to be defined in your suite of policies as well. So you've enumerated, and the organization has the policies, the tools, matrices follow for screening, and the matrix of understanding what to do if positive or negative. And you've also created the rule of two. So I think part of the conversation for me here is, given the limitations of what we can and can't do, I'll come back again to the rule of two. A screening tool is as good, the screening is as good as the day it's done. It is an important step police services, child protection services talk all the time about how important to do screening is, and to understand that it is a step, an important step in applying safe sport practices. So I'll leave that one there. And, you know, Mike and Elana, if you and your delegates are interested in a more in-depth conversation, and that's something you'd like to take on, we would be happy to support that.
Thanks, Lorraine. The next question, and I'll answer this from a provincial level, and then maybe Lorraine can add something from a national level, is around safe sport standards that around safe sport standards outside of the PSO NSO jurisdiction. So private enterprise, recreation departments, and clubs, not only clubs that are not in good standing, but clubs that are not members of. We have situations in Nova Scotia where we have clubs who deliver sport who are not necessarily members of the PSO. So I'll start off by saying that our starting point is going to be the provincial sport organizations in Nova Scotia, because we have funding agreements with provincial sport organizations. So for those funding agreements, we can work with provincial sport organizations to create those safe sport standards through the policy suite and the complaints process. That being said, we recognize that we want so wherever sport happens, it doesn't have to be under a PSO jurisdiction. We want to have safe spaces and places for our participants. So there are things that we obviously the provincial government does have relationships with recreation departments. For example, I presented last year at the Recreation Nova Scotia conference on sort of like sharing the best practice from sport with recreation, and we will continue to do that work. But the way Elana and I feel about this is it's more about the education of Nova Scotians with things like the rule of two and screening, so that as parents start to put their kids into sport, it doesn't matter whether it's they don't differentiate between PSO sport and private sport delivery. So, but then to ensure that parents are armed with the right questions, so they're asking our coaches who are working in this program, are they screened, and recognizing the rule of two, understanding the rule of two, and that's where Elana recognizes and myself that there needs to be work done around public education around things like the rule of two and educate and arming parents with the right questions to ask when they put their kids into activities, and not only sport activities, but obviously any kind of activity that involves children. The other piece here that we've looked at is sort of like is with private organizations still have to rent facilities, and often they rent facilities from the same places as our provincial sport organizations and community. They rent from rec departments. So rec departments having sort of policies in place that says that anybody who rents a space, then they have to be compliant with safe sport standards. And obviously we're not there yet, but these are just ideas that we have around ensuring that regardless of where sport is happening in Nova Scotia, we're providing those safe spaces and places. Do you want to add anything, Lorraine, from a national level?
Yes, I do. Thanks, Mike. So absolutely, that's the way to go, is to get into the facilities and to support their good practice with entrepreneurs or private business. I think this is one of the biggest problems we have in sport, is sorting this out with governments. And let me give you 3 comments. The first one is, from a public point of view, if there's a complaint, sport is sport. That the representative or the media outlet it is not necessarily educated enough to say, oh, are you sanctioned? They don't even understand the word sanctioned. And so I think there's an education around understanding the value of the endorsed system and understanding the value of the municipalities and the recs as well. So that's one piece that I think is important. The good news on the other side of the coin is that we talked about interdependence and vicarious liability. Well, vicarious liability does not extend to the individual who has a private club and who is not sanctioned, not a member, as Mike described, of the PSO. That vicarious liability extends to the facility, as Mike described, which they use to deliver that activity. And so from a very crass legal perspective, that is frustrating, but it's also not something that's within the control if you have a sport that opts to live outside of your organization. So I think those are two important points to think about as part of this conversation. And lastly, I'll just say, Mike, you talked about empowering people to ask the right questions. And I think we need to continue to educate our parents and participants. It's not just about what helmet or what pads, brand of pads to buy or what hockey equipment. It's asking those questions. And what is your code of conduct? What is your rule of two? What is your screening? Those questions are equally as important as the type of equipment to purchase.
Thank you. Elana, do you have anything to add on that question?
No, other than to say that's a perfect segue into what we're trying to do with some of the other stuff, including the video, as I mentioned at the outset, was this education and awareness campaign to get the dialogue going. And with 6,000 views, that might be 6,000 more people who are talking. On Facebook alone, that might be 6,000 more people who are talking and who are now sort of thinking about safe sport. Again, with the Safe Sport website, with the Safe Sport one-pager that will be given out at the time of registration that lives right now on the website. Those are the things that we are trying to do to get the dialogue to started, to have those questions, to start going out into the communities when we can go out safely. And maybe it's Zoom for now and for the foreseeable future, but having these conversations and these questions and answers so that we are having these conversations. So I think that was, thank you for setting me up for that perfect segue to conclude this presentation. I don't see any chats, and Kate, you can text me if you've seen anything. I haven't seen any questions come up about the presentation itself. If you do, please put them in now or raise your hand, and somehow you'll get heard. While we're waiting for those, if you don't have any questions now, feel free to send them to me. My email is in the chat box. If you don't already have it, feel free to send to Mike. If you have any questions for Lorraine, if you have her contact information, Lorraine, I hope it's okay to send them to you.
Absolutely.
Or again, you can send them to me directly. I'm just looking at before I make the announcement. No, Kate doesn't have anything on her end. So we're going to just wrap.
Just one thing to add, Elana, yeah. Just on the like with COVID, I mean, the reality is that sport is now happening again, and we're lucky in Nova Scotia that we're in a positive COVID situation that allows sport to sort of resume under COVID restrictions. We can have up to 50 people, but a lot of the facilities are not allowing parents into the facilities right now because of these restrictions. So I think it's even more important at this time that clubs understand that there must, like, there's going to be less parents around, so they must follow the sort of that rule of two, sort of like to follow those guidelines and things, and remind parents that clubs are following those guidelines. So I think that's another piece that's a reality of where we are now with the sport.
Yeah, and Mike, I just want to touch on that as well. I think that's very, very important. What we don't want to see happen is maybe appreciating the financial pressures that a clubhouse faces, capacity go, okay, I'm going to have 49 participants with one coach because I can get 49 people in with registration to sustain the club versus 48 participants with 2 coaches with rules. And so I think that's really important. And I think one last thing I'll just touch on that is, I think part of the challenge we're all facing here is understanding online environments as well. And I should have touched on that maybe a little bit earlier. And the research is very clear. Social media is a gateway to access. It is where the trend is increasing in terms of grooming and access to individuals. So I get questions like, well, my athlete wants to text all the time. Well, interestingly, I can tell you that Gymnastics Alberta won't allow a coach to text an athlete without having somebody else on the copy line. And it either has to be another coach or it has to be a screened member of the board of directors for that to happen. Many organizations are implementing that. Many organizations ban the one-on-one on Messenger, on Facebook, on or Snapchat, etc., because they are gateway areas. And then the last thing I'll mention is that, you know, creating an organizational legacy email alias. So communication at softballns.ca is actually an important corporate legacy, that if your coaches have communications, depending on how you design it, that resides with the organization, that stays with you in a way for future complaints or future concerns, and or that can be monitored in real time, is a really critical step to take. So I appreciate the fatigue that the rule of two causes in an online environment. However, I do have to tell you, it is a gateway, and it needs to be monitored and implemented.
That's a really good point, Lorraine. And in some of the conversations I've had with sport organizations, I always encourage them to, obviously they're used to the emailing and texting of athletes, and whether the athletes are under the age of a majority or whether they're adults. So my recommendation is always, can they use a third-party platform, something like Team Snap, that will record all the conversations that happen, and secondly, have those pieces in place that have other people on the conversations. And with kids, it's always the parents are always included in that. You cannot email a kid independent without emailing the parent at the same time.
Thank you both for those really important comments. It comes up, as you know, a lot, especially with COVID, the virtual conversations, the digital conversations. So thank you. Those are really important comments. We did receive one question just before we wrap up. And the question is, if two coaches travel away to away events with athletes, should we always strive for one male and one female coach? And I will throw that to you, to both, or one.
I'll let Lorraine answer that first.
Thank you. Well, so this brings in a conversation which we're still navigating, which incorporates LGBTQIS+. So I give that context in this conversation. Obviously, we have to be very situational about this question. If two coaches are traveling away to a training camp for a month or for an extended period of time, a competition, and it's 5 15-year-old girls, the answer is yes, that should be considered. And it should be considered in a context of, if you only have two female coach, who else can you add? Is there a physio? Is there a volunteer, a screen volunteer? And so it really needs to be thought through in the context of what is the environment that we find ourselves in, and what are the conditions that they will find themselves in this extended period of travel. So these are really good scenario-based questions that need as much detail as possible before you give an answer. And then when you give an answer, it's the communication of that scenario and what should be expected for the parents, for the coaches, and for the athletes. And that includes what they should experience while they're away. And so there's many ways to answer this question. And I always come back to be explicit and explicitly communicate expectations to everyone involved.
I mean, just to add to that, Lorraine, I mean, I always go back to Alison Forsyth, who was the alpine skier who was sexually abused by her coach. And she says in her presentation that she feels that if there'd have been a female on those trips that Alpine Canada put on for their athletes, female athletes to go with their coach, she doesn't feel that the abuse that happened could have happened, or at least would have someone to. She just feels that would have been absolutely critical as a preventative measure for what happened to her.
That's right, Mike, because when she finally disclosed, it happened on the first time there was a female therapist on the team, and that was when she finally disclosed. And so I think that's such an important part of thinking about how abuse and grooming works.
Okay, I hope that answered your question. And again, please forward any other questions again to myself if you want to use me. And I can, I'm always the first person to say that if I can't answer your question, I will ask. And I have two experts here who have not only helped me since January 2nd, but who I will continue to rely on. I wanted to thank both Lorraine and Mike. And the Safe Sport Working Group, if you're out there, I can't see you, but thank you guys for giving me the opportunity to work with you for the last, I guess we're at almost 10 months. Mike and Lorraine, thank you for being here on this presentation. Thank you for almost 50 of you for being here, listening to us in our first presentation of our Safe Sport Month. We're super excited. Please watch the video. Please share the video. Again, look at the website, get excited about the one-pager. If you ever have any questions or want to be involved in any aspect of Safe Sport, please reach out to me. Just a few announcements. Again, this was recorded and will be uploaded later. Our next presentation is next Thursday at the same time, and it's with True Sport, and I'm so excited for this one. As I said at the beginning, we've done some True Sport. There's been the working group who has done some work with True Sport. I think we all left mouths agape, and I'm really, really excited for this. So please register and RSVP. Thank you, Kate, for setting this up and helping, and everybody who made this work today. I wish you all a wonderful day. Thank you so much again. Be well, be safe, and until our next Safe Sport presentation.